Now, later on this year, a memorial will be unveiled in London to the men and women of Bomber Command and their bravery during the Second World War. Well, a Devon author has written a novel, One Day in June, about this time in our history. Colin Beazley, who lives in Chumley, is with me now. Hello, Colin.
Hello.
Tell us a bit about Bomber Command. I mean, we all know about the Second World War, but what was Bomber Command?
Bomber Command was a huge force that was really mobilised in the war to take on a range of activities. Probably the most famous under Bomber Harris, as he was known, was to go and do mass bombings of areas in occupied countries to just devastate the landscape and cause confusion amongst the workers, to bring about a weakening of their resolve, really. But the particular part I've written about is more about the activities of Bomber Command out of Bedford, Cambridgeshire area, where they were going and supporting the resistance in the Maquis in France, supporting with agents flying out and taking out supplies to actually do the underground fighting that was preparing the way for the D-Day landings.
So how did you get interested in this particular aspect of it?
Right. I was 3 Christmases ago wandering around on the internet like many people do and came across a story about a small village in France that had been completely devastated in the very last days of the war, and the story sort of captured my imagination, and I thought, well, I really didn't know anything about it, and I thought maybe many other people wouldn't, and from that I worked backwards, and one of the things that happened was I've got a very good friend near me who owns an airfield on his farm, Nigel Skinner, and we went and visited another farming friend who used to be an mid-upper gunner in a bomber, and this gentleman, we spent a day with him talking about and reflecting on all his experiences, looking at the artefacts he collected, and just his enthusiasm instilled me to think, well, there's a story here, but more importantly what it was, Sophie, probably was the fact of thinking, these are stories that are going to be lost. Now, it's one thing to sort of say, I'm not writing a history book, but on the other hand, we're all shaped by what's gone before. And so that started me off talking to a couple of dozen ex-RAF veterans, people who'd experienced the war, and putting together the fiction, if you like, the novel around the facts.
So you kind of got inspiration from something which kind of captured your imagination, but how did you actually go about making it authentic? Because I guess that's quite a task in itself.
It is, and I got completely bogged down with that. I did loads and loads of research, lots of reading, went and visited the only Halifax bomber, because the story hinges around a Halifax bomber in the country, which is up in Yorkshire, which has been reconstructed, talked to lots of people. Before I knew where I was, there's sort of 2 people, I've got a man and a woman who'd helped me, friends who'd helped me edit the book from different angles, and they said to me, are you writing a history book, or are you writing a novel? And so it probably still isn't quite right, but the balance. But I just got very wrapped up in what was going on in the history. So one of the ways round that was to try and extract the history, put it on a website, put notes in the novel, so that anyone who wants to read the history can reflect back to that from the text. Those that don't want to can just read through the actual story and hopefully find the story interesting, absorbing, and exciting. Because
a lot of authors who do set their books in a particular period do say that it's very easy to get bogged down and possibly sidetracked by the amount of historical details, because you want it to be accurate, but on the other hand, sometimes it can take over. Yeah, absolutely. And I was walking into my lounge at home, my wife was as well, and we were almost tripping over piles of books and old films, and you know, the word was, when's this all going to stop, you know, really? And but I just got more and more absorbed in the whole thing, really. And you mentioned at the beginning, it's important that these things don't get forgotten. How do you think that writing your book helps with that, then? Well, what I've done in the book is try to encapsulate lots of real life experiences, true stories that have happened to those that took part and were involved, men and women in the war. And I'm hoping that although it's a story, it's a novel, people will, you know, some of that will sink in. Not least of all, the very beginning of the book. I was born in the 40s, but just after the war in London. The very beginning of the book, it very much focuses on what I remember as a child and what I was told about as a child of life was like in London after the war. And so the book, people already said to me, well, I've read that, and actually
I was in the London area. I was outside London home counties, and some of those things really ring true. I can remember things like that. I can remember our bathrooms being as cold and as chilly and scraping off the ice, the windows and stuff. And so I'm hoping that some of that brings a real truth to it, which then, as they go further into the book, they will also feel needs to be attributed to some of the stories of the actual war itself.
It sort of validates the rest of it. Yes.
Exactly.
It's very interesting. I'm talking to Colin Beazley about his book, which is basically called One Day in June. It's about Bomber Command, and we're going to find out shortly a little bit more about all the research which goes into writing a book like this. But Colin, once you feel you know the period and you've got the facts behind, it's then the thing is to turn it into a compelling story about one person, isn't it?
Yes.
How did you go about that?
Well, I decided one of the things I wanted to do was just focus, as you say, on that one person rather than have a story that darted around all over the place. It was perhaps more difficult to follow. And so what I looked at was a young man who was 19 in North London, outbreak of war, who decided he didn't want to be outside of this. He didn't want to be thrown into wherever the forces felt he needed to go. He wanted to go and be a pilot in the RAF. And he had this dream, so he signed up to the RAF, and there would I have been probably, had it not been for about 20-odd years. I was, this was ahead of me. And he then went into the RAF, trained, became a navigator, qualified navigator, flew in bombers, and that was really the start of his experiences as he travelled around the country, the UK, and then went over and started regular flights across to France, taking out supplies to the resistance in France. From there, the story develops, and of course, as expected, not all goes well. And he crashes, as several veterans told me happened to them. He doesn't become a prisoner of war, unlike some of them, but is taken in by family, has a relationship in the family with the young daughter who looks after him, and then escapes through the Comet Line back down to Gibraltar, through Spain, and then back to England. And when he gets back to the UK after having sort of gone to hospital and tried to, through convalescent and the rest of it, he then sort of tries to make a go of things, but it's hugely frustrated for him, difficult being demobbed and trying to find work in what is a very changing world, really. And eventually decides he needs to go back to France. He needs to go back and find the village and the family that looked after him. And that's really towards the end where the story crystallises and discovers to his surprise what turns out to be quite horrific news, but also something that magically changes his life as well. And that's where the story concludes. Because
there needs to be that sort of crisis point or revelation, doesn't there, to make the story work?
It does. And interestingly, I'd come up with a pattern of the story, and then I had sent through from Aircrew Association in Woking, who supported me and gave me lots of information, a newspaper cutting that actually was about a young man who now is very, very old, and it was about his experiences, and it doesn't completely track that, but it's very, very close to actually what happened to him in the war. And so I felt slightly reassured to think, well, at least I wasn't picking up too much fiction here. There was an element of reality about it all, really.
And how has it affected you, writing this and creating the story about this period which is so important in our history?
I came out of North London from a secondary school, a pretty limited education. I had a job in the early 60s which thrust me into employment before I did anything in the way of exams. And therefore, really, my background in history and English and all of that is very, very limited. So one of the things it's done is taught me an awful lot about this period of time and how perhaps that has influenced and changed the ways we see things now that I never actually got from school. And so that focus, that study has made a change to me. I always wanted to write something. I didn't know what it was, but I always wanted to write something. I guess probably a large percentage of the population always feel like that. There's a book in me somewhere.
That's right.
So I wanted to do that. And as I say, the discovery of this sort of said to me, right, now or not at all, really. So I had a bash, and it started off as something for my own interest, my own desire, if you like. And then part way through, that little tricky conversion comes that says, well, if I finish it, I hope other people will like it. I hope other people might buy it. gosh, how am I going to market it?
That's always the thing, isn't it? That's the thing. I mean, they say that, the publicity and all that it can be just as difficult as actually writing the thing.
Yeah.
But I've got the book here, One Day in June, and it's basically got sort of blue sky and poppies on the front.
Yes.
Why did you go for that image?
Right.
Not a sort of a bomber fighter plane?
Yes, exactly. I think because it isn't just about the fighting and the war and the bombers. It's a much broader story than that. It's much more about people and relationships. But also, I didn't want to create a cover that didn't represent the book, i.e. one that looked as though really this is a man's book, a man's novel, and it's only going to be somebody like that who, it's only going to be a man who's actually going to find it interesting. I think the book is interesting. I'm told it's interesting by women who've read it, and therefore I wanted to create a cover that was appealing, was bright, was not dowdy, but was not limiting to one particular group, really.
And it's quite topical because they're going to be unveiling a memorial in London to Bomber Command.
They are indeed, yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, from the very end of the war, many people have, not only those related to folks from Bomber Command, but have said to me, well, of course, Bomber Command never really recognised, were they? And of course, Winston Churchill, when he gave his thanks and concluded, never mentioned Bomber Command. And whether that was something to do with the way in which the intensive Millennium bombing campaigns went ahead and the devastation that caused and the controversy around that, I don't know. But there's never been a memorial or any recognition in that sense nationally to all those who took part in Bomber Command. And so on the 28th of June this year, central London, Piccadilly entrance to Green Park, building a £3.5 million memorial to Bomber Command. 55,500 men and women lost their lives in Bomber Command. They say something like 100, 200 women were involved in Bomber Command who also lost their lives. And so it's going to be a huge memorial. I haven't seen it. I'm going up on the 28th to actually take part and sort of see that and sort of celebrate and sort of remember, I suppose, an act of remembrance. People flying in from all over the world, of course, veterans and families. And my two sons, I've got two sons, two of my four boys, because they actually live in London, and they said, it's really strange because we're walking around London to work, or we've gone through around Green Park, and we can see they're doing loads of excavation work, loads of machines. What's it all about? And I said, well, they're building this memorial. And they said, well, when's it going to open? 28th of June. They said, never going to be finished. Never. But it will, I'm sure it will. So it's going to be a huge event.
Well, Colin, thank you for coming in, telling us about your book. If people want to buy it, how can they get hold of it?
Well, there's a website dedicated to it, which is www.onedayinjune.info, and they can order it on that directly. Or equally well, it's available from a range of bookshops, including the bookshop in Oakhampton, Tavistock, Torrington, Bideford, and Crediton. And then Waterstones as well now are stocking it, which is good news, and so it's available through them. Or other bookshops can actually order it directly and get it in from them.
Well, Colin, thank you for coming in. The book is One Day in June by Colin Beazley, and as you mentioned, it's available at quite a few local bookshops, and there's also a website which is www.onedayinjune.info. Thank you very much indeed, Colin.
Thank you very much.
For coming.